Maybe it's the case that we have to sit with this kind of like psychic contradiction for a little while.
Nietzsche would be like, yeah, it is, but it's bad. So stop self-negating, fucking pussies. Yo, what is going down? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And I'm dealing with a little bit of hay fever, man. We've had some gnarly winds. I don't know if you've heard about the bushfires that we've had out here, but they're pretty intense. Yeah. Damn, it has been intense. So not only has my hay fever been going crazy, but there's also ash in the air. And of course, I'm complaining about having congested sinuses and people's houses are burning down and, you know, people have died. So I guess I'll shut the fuck up. But anyway, I'm just making excuses so that if I sniffle in this episode, that you guys will forgive me.
That's crazy, man. The world's a weird place. I'm literally looking outside at snow.
Oh, shit. It's snowing? Wow. It's going to be a white Christmas for Troy this year.
Probably not.
Well, probably not. But it'll be a slick and sloshy, muddy Christmas this year for Troy.
I'll just muddle my memories such that November and December get, materialized into one thing.
That sounds good. That sounds good. And so just for a heads up to let people know for our main segment this week, we're going to kind of do some, remember our old bullshitting segment, Troy, that we used to do?
Oh, yeah.
Where we kind of used to bullshit about something that we really didn't know too much about. We're kind of going to do something like that. We're going to talk about a book that neither of us have read.
In proper not Zizekian fashion, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But we're not really going to talk about the book. I'm just going to take some select quotes from this book based on a review that was written by Brian E. White in Freeze. And it's based on this book called Everyone is Female and Everyone Hates It by Andrea Long Chu, who is I think a very fantastic writer who I follow on Twitter. And I've read a lot of her pieces elsewhere that she's published. But her first book is out. It's called Females. And that is her... Okay, I guess the book isn't called Everyone is Female. Yeah. That's kind of the tagline, I should say. Everyone is female and everyone hates it. Yeah, the book is called Females. And that's kind of the theme, I guess, of the book, that everyone's female and everyone hates it. So we'll get into that, but I think there are other things from the quotes that I'm going to extract from this review that I want to bounce off Troy, and then we'll see if we can get a conversation going from there. Does that sound good, brother?
Yeah, man. I kind of love the idea that the bullshitting segment we used to do, like, it was constitutively lazy. Like, the whole point of it was just to riff on a thing we don't know anything about. And we almost, like, over-enacted the constitutive principle of the segment by just no longer doing it. Being too lazy to even do it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So that's coming up in our main segment. But first we have a review, right, brother?
Yeah, so we've mentioned before that if you leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is, we'll do our best to make sure you find it and then name drop you in the podcast. And if you ask a question in your review, we'll answer it. As always, if we miss that for some reason, then just send us a tweet or an email or whatever and let us know, and we'll definitely make up for that. So we have a review in Apple Podcasts from Gummy Bearface from Denmark, who says, "Hi guys, love the show. I'm a philosophy student from Denmark, and at my university, there's quite a large debate as to whether people sympathize with analytical or continental philosophy. In my opinion, I don't see the reason for such a sharp divide. So I wanted to ask you what your experiences are in regards to this divide, and is it something you experience in your work?" So we're, I think, pretty primed for talking about that issue, right?
I would say so. So you go first. What do you think about this?
Yeah, so the reason I mentioned being primed for this is I think me especially, I have, I guess, in a sense, degrees from schools which work in both continental and analytic philosophy circles. So I have experience kind of enmeshed in the middle of both of those things. And I do think there's a reason for the divide. I mean, the terms do name something that's different about these two different kind of methods for approaching philosophy. And it's also true that there's some sense in which the content is somewhat different between the two. There are just certain issues that continental philosophy, because of its orientation, is going to be concerned with, where analytic philosophy is just not going to concern itself with because of its different methods. But there's also overlap as well. Obviously, the entire history of philosophy up to Kant is shared by the two for the most part. So there's a sense in which the classic problems of philosophy are still shared by the two, but then the differing methods kind of focus on different parts of that history or of the concepts dealt with in the history. So there's a reason for the divide, I think, especially from Kant until the mid 20th century. But I am glad that there's sort of a push to have the two schools talk to each other a bit more and deal with problems from the other a bit more. As there's no reason, I think, why there can't be dialogue between the two. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of animosity between the two schools and people basically calling the other either nonsense or frivolous or trivial. And that's, I think, unfortunate and bad and wrong. And that understanding can be had between the two schools and also mutual dialogue without necessarily having to adopt wholesale the methods of each side. So basically, quickly, I just think there's a reason for the divide. It names something that's real. But we can also work to sort of bridge the gap a little bit more and have the schools talk to each other. And it can be fruitful dialogue because I think that both sides are lacking a bit by not having dialogue with the other side.
Yeah. And, there are plenty of scholars out there that are working kind of in the gap, right? I mean, Troy, your work is, I would imagine, is going to continue to be for the rest of your life kind of standing in that gap in a lot of ways. But you get people like Paul Livingston, Pete Wolfendale, people who are very adept with both domains and that write.
Marcus Gabriel, who we'll talk a lot more about in the future of this podcast.
Yeah, because we're going to kind of look through one of his books. So, there are people out there that reject the strict bifurcation. And I kind of have a completely different, not a completely different, but quite a different educational path from Troy, because all of my degrees are from continental philosophy or within continental philosophy departments, or at least, that's I think that's it. Yeah, there's like I didn't read any David Lewis, or I didn't read any Kripke or anything like that in any of my studies. As a matter of fact, those names never even fucking came up, So, I mean, Rawls comes up, but that's just political philosophy, right? So, of course, Rawls is going to come up. But in terms of analytic metaphysics, analytic epistemology, the problems of analytic epistemology, things like that, no one ever talked about fucking Daniel Dennett in any of the seminars or anything that I really ever did, except as a brief asides. And that's even the conferences that I attended and the conferences that I organized. There was very little crossover with analytic philosophy, unless there was a person or two who was among the 20 or whatever papers that was kind of the outlier that was trying to do some kind of bridging of the divide. But generally speaking, I was pretty much immersed in those continental contexts. And it's a very different language. I feel like it's much more literary. It's much more enigmatic. And I think there's something intentional. And I'm going to say this, and I think this is both to its detriment, but I think personally it's also to its, as a sort of boon to it, is that I think continental philosophy tends to be much more poetic. And I mean that both in the sense of, formally speaking, in terms of the format is kind of a poetic style, but also in the sense that it's trying to bring being forth, kind of thing, right? It's trying to enact creations of, processual creations or something like that. Whereas analytic philosophy doesn't seem to generally have a kind of process philosophical or kind of more malleable or metaphysics of difference kind of foundation,
Yeah, the methodological differences between the two schools is much bigger than just this, but there's some sense in which you can kind of encapsulate it in the difference between the virtue of clarity and sort of discussion over that idea being a virtue, right? Analytic philosophy seems to sort of value clarity as being sort of the ultimate virtue of philosophy, or at least one of the ultimate virtues, right? One of the key virtues. And there's a sense in which lots of continental philosophy, especially starting from Heidegger, seems to think that clarity sometimes can mask a good thought, right? It can be detrimental to good thought. And so it's much bigger than just that, but that sort of keys you into where the methodological differences kind of stem from. What are the virtues of philosophy? There's some differences there.
And it isn't to try to be a smarty pants and use jargon or something like that, or to try to be convoluted for the sake of it. It's precisely what you're saying, that Heidegger believes that when people are just saying something, they're probably engaged in some kind of idle chatter, or they're probably inheriting language or terms or phrases or whatever that themselves aren't creative. And so for Heidegger, one of the big concerns is to try to figure out how to use language that can actually speak being. And so you get this post-Heideggerian tradition of people who are all trying to use language in a way that kind of stretches what language might even be able to do, because the assumption is that language is insufficient, right? That there is something beyond, outside, or excessive of our linguistic capacities or structures. And so that's why you do get a lot of continental philosopher types that engage a lot with Wittgenstein. There's a lot of work with Witt, but you don't really find too many continental philosophers that are like, I'm going to deal with Bertrand Russell, you know?
Yeah, which I mean, you can't really understand Wittgenstein without understanding Bertrand Russell. But yeah, I do think that, yeah, the emphasis on language there, and Wittgenstein being kind of the person who introduces a different element to language from the early analytic philosophy use of language. It keys you into why continental philosophy figures tend to deal with that. But then the whole ordinary language philosophy school that follows from Wittgenstein in the analytic circle is sort of ignored by continental philosophy, which I think is kind of funny.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, I mean, I probably should, and I often do think that I will, and that I should engage more with analytic philosophy. It's something that, you know, one of my many, I don't know, lines on my to-do list, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I mean, we do on the podcast, right? And you keep me up to date on continental stuff, and we read some papers and books and that deal with analytic stuff. So we keep ourselves abreast.
Sounds good to me. All right, sweet. Also, we do want to just do a quick reminder that if you find value in what we're producing here and you enjoy our content and you want access to bonus stuff, please go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn. You can support us there by signing up for one of our tiers. $5 a month gives you the whole shebang, bonus episodes, newsletter, as well as being able to recommend topics for future episodes. And then there's the $2 tier, which just gives you access to the Democracy Motherfuckers, which gives you a say when we do put out the call, let's say, for topics, and then you get to vote in the poll as well. So go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn to hook us up, peeps. Thank you.
Yeah. So you know what we got to do before we jump into the main segment, Austin?
I'm champing at the bit, brother.
Yeah, man. This is the shitty minute. This is where one of us rants and raves about whatever it is that's grinding our gears this week. So Austin, what's got you down?
So you know how I've been doing this this Bible read on my YouTube channel, right? And
yeah.
I'm reading the Bible every day, and then I'm kind of just uploading a little video on YouTube of my thoughts. You know, they're not always in depth. I'm not like digging through commentaries, or I'm not digging into the original language like some sort of exegetical or expositional study or something like that. A little bit, you know, sometimes because there are phrases that just don't feel right, you know, because I'm using a particular translation and I'm like, I don't know if I like that. And, you know, I go in there and generally my instinct is pretty good because sure enough, I'm like, yeah, I knew that was a kind of particularly reformed, biased translation because I'm using the English Standard Version at the moment.
Why would you do that?
And I know it's just because it's pretty easy to read, and it is still, you know, pretty like literal of a translation. I might switch to like King James actually, just to fucking go straight into that beautiful language. But anyway, that's not the point. The other day, I'm going through Genesis, Exodus. I'm looking through the Torah, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so I did a little bit of digging up on the documentary hypothesis just to kind of like refresh myself and kind of, you know, remind me of my undergraduate days of my Old Testament classes with Dr.
It's been a while, right?
It's been a while, dude. So I was like, I'm just going to refresh myself, see what the See what the new studies are about documentary hypothesis and source criticism.
Wait. See if I can remember. It's the J, the E, the P, and the D, right?
That's right. Do you remember what each of them stands for?
The Yahwist, the Elioist, the Priestly source, whatever, and the Deuteronomist.
Yeah, that is right. That is right.
That stuff is fried into my brain.
Yes, it is. And for people who have no fucking clue what we're talking about, go check out my YouTube video. It's the one that I do in between finishing Genesis and starting Exodus, and it's titled like "Who Wrote the Torah." And but anyway, that's not the point. The thing is so I went down like a deep rabbit hole on YouTube, and I watched some lectures by Old Testament scholars and and other people, and then I fucking Wikipedia rabbit hole, and then I ended up reading like an article and shit like that. And it was a fun evening. But this is my shitty minute. I think it's so funny when secular scholars use BCE rather than BC. And it's not because I have some sort of attachment to like the sacrosanct use of BC as in before Christ. But it's because for some reason, it feels like they're trying so hard to separate themselves from BC. And you know what it reminds me of? And this is my shitty minute because I don't know if it's true or not, but it reminds me of like when Mormons and Christians use euphemisms rather than cuss words. So instead of saying fuck, they say frick. And it's like somehow they think that absolves them. And it's like, no, motherfucker. We know what you're trying to say. They're like, oh, God dang it. And it's like, no, you just said God damn it in your heart. Okay, motherfucker? Like, don't think that just because you changed a couple of the words around and some of the syllables that you get away with this. It's like, you can't
that's like so biblical though, dude. You can just change one little like iota and then everything changes.
It's such bullshit, man. And I feel the same thing when they're like, oh, in 1400 BCE. I'm like, oh, you motherfuckers. We know what you're saying. You just don't want to say it because you got to be all secular and you're checking yourself and you're trying to make sure that you live according to this like taskmaster of being a good secular scholar. Fuck you guys. Come on. Just say it. Ugh.
I'm surprised at this, dude.
Really?
Yeah, because like it's small and insignificant, right? But shouldn't you try to like accurately and in an unbiased way like depict measures of time? Is it kind of weird that we do it based upon like this religious dimension?
It's totally ridiculous. As a matter of fact, I have a quote from Kofi Annan. This makes total sense. So this is what Kofi Annan says. He says, the Christian calendar no longer belongs exclusively to Christians. People of all faiths have taken to using it simply as a matter of convenience. There is so much interaction between people of different faiths and cultures, different civilizations, if you like, that some shared way of reckoning time is a necessity. And so the Christian era has become the common era. So that's why it's CE rather than AD or BCE rather than BC. But that's not the point. You're absolutely right. Let's open this up and universalize the motherfucker. But for some reason, it just feels like they're trying so hard to do it that I'm like, it just feels like forced, you know?
Wait, what makes you think they're trying so hard? Just because they use the term?
I don't know. It just feels that way. Maybe it's just because I'm like super sensitive to when like Mormons say frick or when Christians are like, ah, heck, you know? And I'm like, oh God, stop it. And then they have their like pious purity eyes and they look at you like, oh, I don't swear. And I'm like, you just said shoot way more than I've ever said shit in my life. And they don't mean anything. There's no difference, you know? It's like tone. You can't tell me that shoot in your heart or in your intent or whatever is different than shit in my heart or in my intent necessarily. Like, I just don't buy that shit.
Well, this is why you got to read more analytic philosophy, dude, because you think meanings are in the head. But yeah, anyway, like, yeah, I do get like, I don't know if you feel this way too, but every time I'm reading something that's, academic or scholarly and they'll have the BCE or the CE in there, I think my mind every single time gets removed from the thought process I'm currently in and reading the book or the text and goes to like my thought about some evangelical somewhere who just shut the book in anger at that term being used. Just like happy holidays, right?
Yeah. See, for me, I don't even do that one. I do the kind of like, oh God, some person was just trying to be super secular and they just wanted to stay pure in their secularity. And I was kind of like, yeah, and they think, and then I'm going all Dan Barber, and I'm like, and they think that somehow they've absolved themselves from their own transcendent commitments, but they don't realize their metaphysical bias. And then I'm like, you guys are just the same.
Well, let me ask you, dude. Do you what do you use for neutral gender pronouns?
Comrade.
Imagine a person who goes to the store and comrade then buys some oranges.
Yeah. I've always struggled with this because I was trained like hardcore that you do not confuse the singular and the plural, right? So it's not that Jan went to the store and then when they went to the checkout they did this, you don't do that. That's a confusion. But now it's kind of accepted, and I know that even in English composition classes and stuff like that, like 101 classes, it's becoming more accepted to use they for the singular. And it just it hurts my head. Like I
enact that shit, dude. Yeah.
Yeah.
We need a better term for sure. So, but yeah, what I'm thinking is it is confusing. It's better than, just using the male pronoun, but I do use they, but I wish we had a different term that was gender neutral and singular. But if we do have that at some point, it's going to be awkward to, infuse it into the language, right?
Yeah, which we should just fucking use it and just get over it.
Isn't that going to be awkward too? Even more awkward because it depersonalizes?
Yeah, but fuck it. I mean, I guess what I did, like in my book, for example, is that sometimes I used he and sometimes I use she. I tend to use she more, though. I would say I use she 70% of the time. And see, for me, it's kind of interesting because it's almost like that overcompensation for me is like a political act, right? It's kind of like I'm swinging the pendulum to the other extreme.
Yeah, I get that. There doesn't seem to me there's a good answer to these kinds of things. Like everything is just what's the least bad answer.
And I'm sure that someone might say that, yeah, using common era is a political act because we're rejecting kind of the Western colonial imperialist hegemon.
But then using the exact same dates.
Yeah, then using the exact same dates, I know. Honestly, it's such a small gripe. It just, for some reason, I felt like it was like they were trying so hard to just be super like Mr. Secular. And I was like, okay, dude, like, whatever. It's the exact same dates. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? If someone thinks of it as like a radical political act to use BCE or CE, that's like buying, 1,000 Black Sabbath albums just to burn them. It's like, bro. Okay.
Now, what battle are you winning? Yeah. Okay, dude. Yeah. I know. Ugh. And I'm probably wrong, but fuck it. That's how I was feeling this week, so that's what we get.
No, I definitely know those feels, man. That stuff never leaves you.
For sure.
Yeah, so we want to jump into this book by Andrea Chu?
Yeah, I mean, we'll sort of jump into the book. Yeah, I'm down for it.
Or kind of jump around it? Like skid past it?
So, yeah, exactly.
What's the proper metaphor? I don't know.
You read the review, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have any first impressions going in totally blind? Because you're not really familiar with Andrea's work, right?
Actually, I am.
Oh, you are? Okay.
I recognized her name when you mentioned possibly doing this, but I couldn't remember from what.
I sent you an essay that she wrote a while back, actually, as well. I don't know if
my new vagina won't make me happy one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
Yeah,
and I quite liked it actually. I obviously don't have like a super strong interest in the debate over whether she's a good or proper trans person or a self-hating female or whatever, right? I know there was some pushback on that issue. And I don't have a stake in that debate, but I thought that the essay was really well written and interesting, and I think gets at an important issue. The issue basically just being that just because someone is trans doesn't mean that transitioning is going to fulfill them forever or like solve their problems. Yeah. And we shouldn't expect it to. That's not what transitioning is about, right? And that kind of deflates a myth I think that a lot of people have about trans people, and that even some trans people that I know that I've talked to have not universally, I guess, because I only know a few, but have talked about similar issues. And I think that resonates fairly well. Not in my own experience, obviously, but I think in a lot of people's experience.
Mm. Yeah, I know that there was a lot of debate about the issue of passing, right? Especially surrounding like ContraPoints in some of the videos that Natalie had put out. And again, I don't know. I'm kind of just listening on these debates, but I know this is a really heated topic. And I kind of almost like it's one of these things that when there's like a really sensitive and hot political issue at the moment, it's really hard to not say anything because I feel like we live in a socio-political climate where we are sort of like commanded to speak or say something with like preformed intelligence and cogence all the time. And I don't.
Yeah, please deposit your opinion before you pass by the bars, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know so much, and I know that makes people uncomfortable. Like people ask me for opinions all the time, and sometimes I say I'm still working through it, and I can see in their eyes that there's like a it's not a disappointment, but it's almost like a judgment, even, right?
Don't like, you have priors, sir?
Yeah, yeah. I know. So, but I've really enjoyed reading her as well. I think she's actually an excellent writer, and just somebody who has like the power, like over rhetoric to me is someone that I'm kind of automatically attracted to their output, So I think she's an excellent writer. So I may read the book at some point, but I haven't read the book yet. But there's this review by Bryony White, and it's in freeze.com, and it has some interesting things to say about the book that I thought would be like an interesting launch pad for us to kind of BS a little bit. So, Troy, what were like your first impressions just reading the review, or if you had any thoughts?
I thought it was super interesting. I did want to talk about just the title since it's a quote from the book itself.
Okay.
And talking here about rhetoric, I think, and even kind of harkening back to our own discussion, a few minutes ago about continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, and this idea of clarity of language being sort of a virtue. There's some purposefully unclear rhetorical statements.
Yes.
It seems littered throughout this book, and done so for a reason. Now, if that reason is purely provocation, you can have some takes about that, but even provocation itself can be a virtue in certain circumstances, I think. But that doesn't even mean that this is purely provocation. So, dancing around the issue here, the quote that I'm thinking of is the title of the review, "Everyone is female and everyone hates it," is pretty interesting and super catchy. That's an effectively rhetorical quote to take from the book.
Yeah. When I first read it, in my mind, I was thinking, like, is this going to be one of those yin-yang kind of things, right? But that we live in a world that doesn't allow the one polarity, but that only values the other polarity. That you have like the dominance of, let's say, patriarchy, and therefore the elements of the feminine are despised, excluded. But nevertheless, we can't actually deny the reality that that element is integral in a cohesive whole. That's what I was thinking when I initially saw the title,
Yeah, I didn't have any thoughts. I just, because obviously there's a practical seeming contradiction in the first half of the sentence. So, as usual, my analytic philosophy brain goes to like, how can I keep the intentional content of the statement the same, but use different words? And so, yeah, I'm looking for, reading the review, looking for different content to substitute there for female.
Okay, so it was the word female because it's attached to biological sex that initially triggered you or caught your attention?
Yeah, I mean, everyone is female. Clearly an inaccurate factual statement if taken literally. So what do we have to substitute for female there to make the sentence still intentionally the same, but have a different content?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I think
okay,
it actually
so what else?
kind of does that, right? later on, it seems there's like a thesis statement of the book that is named here, where Chu says the thesis of this little book is that femaleness is a universal sex defined by self-negation. That's still been ambiguous, right? And so after that, she says, I'll define as female any psychic operation in which the self is sacrificed to make room for the desires of another. And that was the moment where I knew, oh, this is why Austin wants to talk about this. Because there's some Lacanian vestiges here.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest. The first thing that popped into my mind, beyond the fact of like male-female sexuation, which popped into my head throughout as I was reading this, right? But you know what else popped up into my head a lot was the idea, just in general, kind of like detaching for a minute the moniker of femaleness, but this idea of self-negation that I find so interesting, that I think I struggle with figuring out actually where to come down on whether on how to value or how to criticize the idea of self-negation. So from a Christian perspective, you get the valorization of self-negation. Die to self, sell everything you have, come follow me, take up your cross daily, etc., 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 right? Mortification of sin in someone like John Owen, the perpetual self-hating that Nietzsche rails against. And then, of course, my mind went to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's criticism. You know, he says, I've got a quote here in Beyond Good and Evil. He says, the Christian faith from the beginning is sacrifice, the sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-confidence of spirit. It is at the same time subjection, self-derision, and self-mutilation. Now, he's being critical of this. I mean, he calls Christianity resentment or ressentiment. It's weak-willed. And so there's something about this idea of self-negation, self-destruction, that Nietzsche criticizes, that Christianity valorizes, that psychoanalysis valorizes, and I think some other ways. And then, so in Andrea's book here, this idea that femaleness is identified as a psychic operation in which the self is sacrificed to make room for the desires of another seems to imply that she's establishing a type of metaphysical theory of femaleness, or at least, let's say, a metaphysical theory of self-negation, as being this idea of sacrificing yourself to make room for the desires of others. And then she says, okay, and that's what we will call femaleness. Not female biology, not the feminine, but like the essence of femaleness, which she calls, what does she call it? In like an existential condition, a universal existential condition, which I think is really kind of interesting to think through, you know?
And she also says psychic operation, so that we can take those as being mostly synonymous, right?
Yeah, so it's structural, it's a psychic operation, and it's a universal existential condition. So it's also metaphysical. So she's creating like a metaphysics here of self-negation and then calling it femaleness. No?
Yeah. I'm not sure what do you mean by it being metaphysical?
That it is, you know, a kind of a priori, that it is prior, that it is beyond the empirical, that it is formal. Maybe it's transcendental. Would that be better? But it is opening up to kind of the ground, if you will, of being.
Yeah, so it's not known a priori, but it's like in some sense structures experience such that it's not something you strictly find through experience. Is that the idea?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so transcendental. Yeah, transcendental is a good word, I think, for that. So, I mean, kind of the obvious question here, and the one I keep kind of wanting to address: why, if it's this transcendental structural condition on experience, such that you can actually say everyone is this and everyone hates it.
Yeah.
Why female? Why use that term? Like, what's the point? If it's clearly not the sex or any reference to the gender which is associated often with that sex, why use that term?
Well, so this is what I was thinking. So a lot of my work at the moment is dealing with mathematical algorithms, linear algebraic pricing models that are used to mitigate uncertainty in market transactions in like the domains of financial speculation and things like that, right? And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how there is a type of performative and forceful analytic rationality that accompanies these pricing models. And it does so through a type of relationship with a type of relationship with a certain metaphysical understanding of how the world is, that the world has uncertainty and chaos and things like that, but we can, if we just have enough inputs or enough positive variables and we have enough data, then we can mitigate the effects of that uncertainty and potentially prevent it from ever like having any sort of detrimental effects or whatever, right? That's risk management in a nutshell. But that's really what pricing models do, is they try to predict flows and they try to predict trends and predict consumer behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And they do that by looking at like prices, historical prices and historical trends and all kinds of other things. And then they kind of like factor in volatility and various other inputs that they'll put into, like the most famous pricing model is called the Black-Scholes-Merton model, the BSM model. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is how there's kind of almost, if we kind of tie this to Lacan's division between male and female sexuation, that there's kind of like a masculine or a male logic that accompanies the logic of the algorithm. It's that it is always trying to prevent castration, prevent chaos, to push the chaos away, to completely mitigate it from actually existing. Whereas female sexuation is not about that. It's the non-all, right? And so I think that what I thought was interesting about this is, why is it female? Is that this idea of self-negation is contrary to that kind of active will of Nietzsche, or the need to overcome castration of male sexuation, or like the capitalist logic of pure positivity that has to cover over everything and it has to refuse all negativity for pure positivity, for the yes, for the answer, for that which covers over the cracks. That seems to be the kind of dominant logic of late capitalism, and that seems to be associated also with a masculine logic. The masculine logic of dominance, of, again, refusing castration or negation or weakness or anything like that. But the self-negation, the opening up to weakness, the opening up to the desires of the other, seems to be kind of opened up to a non-male or a non-masculine logic. And then I was also thinking about John Berger in his work, or Berger in his work, and the idea of like the difference between the kind of like the male figures that are in like athletic clothes, and they're like figures of action and doing, whereas the females are always the ones that are looked at, right? The way that they dress, the way that they are adorned, the way that they're posed is always that they are objects of desire, or objects to be looked at. And so they're opened up to the gaze of the other. And I thought maybe all of that kind of fits into what Chu is talking about. Sorry, that was a lot.
Yeah, that is a lot. I'm trying to kind of put that all into like one thought. So is the idea then that the reason to use female here is a reference to sort of Lacanian female sexuation, and sort of keying into that idea that, like Lacan, male and female sexuation isn't a reference to biological males and females. It's relation to structural, psychological categories, right, or psychic categories.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was so important that you referred to it, one, as a psychic operation, but also two, as a universal, and I think the universal is important, a universal existential condition. So it's lived. I think existential probably carries a couple different connotations. It also implies that there's not some sort of like essential metaphysics that's going on, right? Existentialism rejects, or it just says existence precedes essence. So essence is something that's constructed later, right? And it's kind of a fabrication, or maybe in Lacanian terms, we might say it's belongs to the domain of the imaginary, right? Or the symbolic even. But that it isn't prior, it isn't primary. And so I think that's going on by calling it an existential condition, but it's also universal, which means that it's got this structural, this transcendental, this metaphysical application for all, but it expresses itself in different or variations, or like in different and varying intensities, right? So that's why everyone is female, but that doesn't mean that everyone has a vagina or whatever it is, or is XX or whatever, however you want to define femaleness in like typical categories.
Yeah, so I think we should try to be clear here about this idea of the universal existential condition, right? It's not a purely structural one in the sense, and what I mean by that, maybe that's a bit ambiguous. It's not necessarily just the case that given the structural conditions that exist, individuals experience being female or whatever, this sacrificing of oneself, self-negation. This is kind of getting at a deeper like human issue, right? Like, so what I'm getting at is it's not just that like capitalism makes us female and therefore we hate it, which is one thing you can talk about, right? How like current contingent social conditions situate us in such a way that we experience these negative things and we hate it, right? And that's certainly going to be true in a lot of extents. But it seems like she was getting something deeper than that, right? This is more universal than just what like Western capitalist people experience. You think?
I don't know. I think at one level we can stay here and we can say there is something anti-capitalist about this existential condition of femaleness that she talks about, precisely because I would say that capitalism does not allow for self-negation. So if femaleness is to be equated with self-negation, late capitalism is precisely the antithesis of that. It is about self-positivity. It is about being an achievement subject, an entrepreneur of the self. It is about being a portfolio manager of your assets, of social capital, cultural capital, of credit scores, etc. There is no room for self-negation in capitalism. There's no room for time. There's no room for death. There's no room for destruction. It's life, 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 positive, 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 positive all the time. So I think
there's room for self-negation for some people, though. Like there's only certain people that get to fully enact that.
Say that again?
It seems like if some people, like people who have the most privilege and the most power, are going to be ones who are fully involved in this self-positivity, right? But that's always going to, because of like limited resources and whatnot, going to mean that some people then have to self-negate so that those who can actually enact like the late capitalist individual can do so. Like some people are going to be told that they don't deserve more, that they have to. They suffer and they deserve their suffering, right? Especially if they're like from a third world country or whatever. And they can't really have democracy because the engine of progress has to continue in the Western countries. Like, I mean, just look at currently right now in Bolivia, right? Can the people of Bolivia democratically elect their president? No, they're not allowed to, right? Because like Tesla needs more lithium or something, right? Germany needs more, whatever the thing was that the Germany was, I can't remember the mineral or whatever it was that Bolivia has a lot of, and that Europe was being threatened by Morales from having like free trade over or something. Whatever the facts are, it's certainly the case that some people are told that they have to sacrifice their desire, sacrifice what they want and need for the sake of like universal progress or whatever.
Well, okay, so two things. I mean, first of all, that's not self-negation, right? So that's some sort of like imposition. So that's like oppression or exploitation. And I wonder how that would fit into this.
It's commanding self-negation. It's saying not only are we going to take this from you, but you deserve it. Like you need to like believe in this sacrifice.
Right. So, but then here's what I would say is here's this where there's this weird type of self-sacrifice, because it's not really a self-sacrifice. It's still ultimately tied into like a chain of meaning, a master signifier of development, right? So modernization theory is like, okay, well, first you start with a little bit of industrialization and then you get democracy a little bit later. But you got to go through the process. You got to be sufficiently industrialized or modernized so that you can get to the next stage, let's say, and then of course you're reaching development. So you're always chasing this chain of development that is being set by the standard bearer of the Washington Consensus. So there's this linear path that you have to follow along. So again, you're being negated from your resistance to that, right? So it's not a negation of self to core. It's that you are being negated from your freedom from the outside. Right? And then once you buy into the system, And then it's all pure positivity again. It's buy, consume, sell, maximize yourself, buy your products, be part of the system. You must be part of the system. There is nothing else that you can do. So I don't know if that's the same thing as what she's talking about. Is it?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily what she's talking about. I'm just trying to get at this idea of
Okay.
late capitalism is pure positivity. It just seems to me like the lumpen proletariat does not get that privilege of pure positivity.
Well, I don't know if it's a privilege. And I think that the lumpen proletariat,
it's certainly cast as a privilege.
Okay, yeah.
For those.
But I still think that the marginalized, those on the periphery, are still they're living under the shadow of that positivity. You know what I mean? Like they're not negated. Means. Say that again.
As its means, right? It's only because some suffer that others are able to enjoy the fruits of this pure positivity.
Yeah, but they are induced to buy into it as well by their, maybe they have a dictatorial government, or they are ravaged by structural adjustment programs. Whatever it is, there's still a sense in which the program is laid out for them, and they buy into it. They must buy into it. Is that like inducing self-negation? Is that what you're saying?
No, I guess I'm just getting the idea that it seems like there's a certain group of people, like you refer to them as marginalized, lumpen proletariat, or whatever, they're just ignored. They're expected to be removed from the system. They're not allowed to participate. They're sort of deemed inhuman. And that kind of has to exist for, the skyscrapers to go up, and for, the NIMBYs to have their housing projects or whatnot, right? So it just seems like there's some sense in which, I don't know, I just don't see the pure positivity being universal. It seems like it has to, even if it casts itself as being universal, in order to exist, there has to be like a domain of negation there. But I don't know. This may be going off on a tangent that we don't have to go down. What did you want to get to with this idea that Chu is pointing at this sort of category of self-negation that exists at the individual level, and this notion of late capitalism as being pure positivity?
Well, even at the political level, I think we can still kind of stick with what you're talking about, because I think that's really interesting. Let's say the lumpen proletariat, to use that good Marxist term, if they are kind of forced into a self-negation, then what is kind of happening there is that there's some sort of resistance, right? There's an outside, there's an excess to the pure positivity of capitalism. It wants to convert everything. It needs to convert everything. It
says it does.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is like where Agamben comes in. Even by excluding, it's including them, right? Like even the kind of the slaves that are mining coltan in the Republic of Congo are included into the system. They're included through their exploitation. They're included by being excluded, right? So there's still some element in which they're incorporated, let's say, into the larger system. So what I wonder then, though, is does that not speak to the fact that capitalism is not hegemonic, right? That there are outsides, that the lumpen proletariat is precisely outside. And so capitalism has this really tenuous relationship with how it's able to deal with them, right? It will hyper-exploit and create like super profits and hyper profits through slave labor, or through like radical depreciation of wages or whatever, or just simply by kind of like deeming them to be the non-human, but nevertheless still using the mineral reserves of the land on which they reside, or the water, or whatever, something like that. But there's this weird kind of like ambiguous relationship that capitalism has with that outside, but nevertheless it speaks to the fact that there is an outside, right? So like you're talking about Bolivia right now, and what's going on in Bolivia is, can they have democratic elections? It's like, no, they're not allowed to. And so they are being quote unquote self-negated, and what's being self-negated is precisely their resistance to, Western capitalist imperialist democracy, right? And so there is an outside. So there's like a post-hegemonic framework that's being discussed here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I kind of, with my own inclinations, I like to kind of locate that part of this contradiction at the sort of moral or normative level, right? And so a great example of this is how much discourse in America is sort of addressed to people who are suffering, or people who are the victims of like structural conditions, people who lose their wealth in 2008, people who are suffering under the burden of huge student loans, people who name the different form of structurally caused suffering to individuals and groups. And those people are told, in a sense, they're removed from the sort of benefits of this pure positivity, right? Because we need to continue to grow GDP by 3%, and that's just going to have some victims, right? And we're not going to sort of adjust the playing field such that everybody can sort of survive and not, lose their livelihood when one of these weird accidents happens. But then also we're going to tell the people and sort of address them as moral agents that they deserve this because they didn't do something right. You wouldn't be a victim if you hadn't done something wrong or incorrect in your past. And so they're like simultaneously addressed as being sort of inhuman because they're not treated fairly, but then also treated as like preeminently human because they're assumed to be moral agents who can understand that they deserve their own suffering. And so this weird contradiction there that I think points to the fact that the system doesn't, the late capitalist system doesn't have a way of properly addressing people like this. It has to see them as both inhuman in one sense and then like preeminently human in the other, because it can't really address what it's done to these people.
Well, there's a third element too, though, right? Because not only does it say that you deserve this and give them that element of kind of perverse, that perverse human inclusion, but then there's also then saying, but you can become just like those millionaires so long as you buy into the system and work hard and get a good education and build your human capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's that element of pure positivity that does come back, right? So it's kind of, I think it's there. It's always dangling the carrot in front of them saying you can so long as you play by the rules.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lie though, right?
Yeah.
That's the key, is that it's a lie. And that's not the case that everyone can actually get the fruits of that pure positivity. There's always going to be some who suffer. And that's the inhuman address, right? It's saying, there's some people who are going to suffer and it's not fair, but whatever, like this is the best we can do. And that's rarely ever like said out loud, because then you get to like the, complete immorality and nefariousness of the system.
Well, here's what's really perverse. It's not only a lie, but it's partly true. And that's why it's even worse. Because, so say someone who's extremely impoverished, living in the projects, but nevertheless they can get a Facebook account and they can spend, or not a Facebook, an Instagram account, and they can do like fitness stuff or whatever it is that they're doing, like in their home, and they can live under that lie, that illusion, as though they are building up social capital, and they might get a couple thousand followers or whatever, but the truth is that they are still kind of buying into the system, or they're kind of being included into the system, but they might most likely never make it to the fact where they're, getting hundreds of thousands of followers and making money on sponsors or something like that, or making money from sponsors or anything like that. But nevertheless, there is a truth to the idea that they're getting something, right? They're getting something from the attention economy, or they're getting some kind of cultural capital in return. And that's why it's even more produced, because it's not just a bold-faced lie. It's not like a, hey, come over here, and then no, you don't get anything. It's you get just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit. And then not only that, but that tiny little bit is going to make you want more. Because as John Hamm says in Mad Men, what is happiness? Happiness is a moment before you want more happiness. So you get that little bit of happiness, and then you just need more happiness, and you need more, and you need more. So then you buy into the logic of positivity, even though you might never be able to actually realize it, because it's not a pure lie. It's mostly a lie, or it's a lie with a little bit of truth. That's kind of like just dangling the carrot in front of you.
Yeah, I think this kind of circles back around to my original question, or one of my original questions, which was, is this getting to something purely about capitalism, or actually something more human than even that?
Ooh,
and I think this shows that it's the latter, in that capitalism is parasitic on something that's already existent within humans, and that's this structure of desire, such that you can, and this is like a classic like psychoanalytic notion, right? That you can never really satisfy your desire. Desire is exists in such a way that it's not to be ultimately satisfied. And yet the whole reason for desire is to convince you that if you just get this one more thing, you'll be satisfied. So it's this like structural contradiction that exists within like the very category of desire itself. And that's more human than capitalism. And capitalism is parasitic upon it. That's why it's so effective, because it discovers this about humans and then weaponizes it.
That's right. So how is everybody female then? In what way? Is it just because everyone deals? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that's how I interpreted it, obviously, having not read the book and not knowing the true answer to this. It seems like you can interpret this and as the basic kind of psychoanalytic notion of everybody is sort of a slave of their desire, right? And we're sort of, as human beings, situated with this complex of desiring things, needing to be satisfied and never being able to. And that is something we all hate, right? Something about the way that current social conditions exist in 21st century America, where most of the readers of this are going to come from, is an especially poignant or unique view of that subjective experience. But it's a universal one by virtue of being a human being, that someone exists in this way. So I think you can make this universalist claim of everyone is female, right? And someone who reads this book in 200 years, when we're either in a post-capitalist utopia or we've destroyed most of living things on Earth, will be able to, in some sense, understand that sentiment because it's universal.
What do you think about the connections that I made between the kind of Christian call to die to self and then Nietzsche's criticism of this idea, and then his offer is to be the strong, affirming will, right?
Yeah, so Nietzsche's obviously being critical of the self-negation inherent in like German Christianity during the 19th century, right?
Right.
I'm curious what you think about what that kind of self-negation, or what relationship that kind of self-negation that Nietzsche's criticizing has to do with take up your cross mentality from the New Testament. I mean, it's going to be like 8 months before you get there in your Bible read through, but I'm curious for like a proleptic response.
So you just want to know like what is Nietzsche getting at here?
Like, how do you fit that? Because obviously Nietzsche criticizes self-negation in a way that Chu is also criticizing self-negation. But it seems like there's going to be different answers given the different modalities of the criticism, right? Or different responses given the modalities of the criticism.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that for Nietzsche, Christianity is viewed as being weak, right? It's self-hating, and it is kind of morose, and it doesn't affirm this world. This world is just a means to an end. The world that really matters is the afterlife, and it's ineffectual, he thinks. And so for him, he obviously wants to kind of almost completely invert that logic. I mean, that's why he wrote a book called The Antichrist. He's inverting that logic to be self-affirming and to be powerful and to be an active rather than reactive force, whereas Christianity is reactive, but rather to be the hammer that smashes things. He talks about philosophizing with a hammer, but I think he kind of would almost want to view a strong-willed person as being one who like is a type of hammer. I'm picturing, God, what's it called? A wrecking ball, basically, right? And so that's what he's getting at. It's this idea of like that self-hating ressentiment, that downtrodden weakness, the turn the other cheek thing that he sees. Like if he were around today, I think he would say that that's pussy shit, is how he would put it, right? To be crass.
Yeah, would Nietzsche be alt-right if you were?
Totally, dude. Come on. You're like Gavin McGinnis, fucking... Totally, dude. They got the mustache too. But so that's what it is, right? It's that Christianity is pussy shit for him. And Christianity sees meekness. The word is actually, in Greek, it's praeus, but it actually means strength under control. Because the idea is like you can kill the body, but what is that going to do, right? And this world is a temporary home, or this world is of secondary importance, which again, then Nietzsche would criticize and be like, oh, great, so you don't affirm this world, you're a fucking nihilist. All you do is this world doesn't mean anything, it's just the afterlife. And which is, people get wrong, they think Nietzsche's a nihilist. No, he says Christianity is nihilistic. Precisely because of that, because it rejects this world as being an end in itself. And for Nietzsche, it's affirming this world, affirming the things of this world, the self, the touch, the smell, the sense, the immediate, right? And so that's why he's critical of Christianity. So anything that denies those things, anything that denies the immanence of touch, anything that denies the immanence of like gratification of self, like he says that Christianity and alcohol are the two greatest evils in the world, right? And again, alcohol is because it kind of like distorts your mind, and it doesn't allow you to be that strong wrecking ball of a force. So it's something along those lines.
So you're saying that Nietzsche was straight edge, is what you're saying?
he 100% was. He totally was. 100%. And he only had sex, and he probably only had sex once in his life, and he got syphilis.
Got syphilis, yeah. That's what you get, motherfucker, for angering God. Have sex once, die of syphilitic insanity. So isn't there a different modality to these criticisms, though? Because it seems like Nietzsche's grasping for like life affirmation, right? And then he sees Christianity as a negation of that, and so it's the enemy.
Right.
And that, Plato as well. So they're twin slave moralities. Whereas it seems like in Chu's diagnosis, if we're interpreting it through the psychoanalytic lens, it's not necessarily just Christianity that does it. Because even in Nietzsche, you have this like kind of like a notion of the fall, where Christianity is the fall, and then you can kind of regain this like some sense of this previous like life affirmation. Although Nietzsche criticizes the masters too, right? And says that they're kind of like happy idiots. But there's certainly something about like master morality that Nietzsche is sort of celebrating and wants to bring back. That doesn't seem to exist for this kind of psychoanalytic reading, right? There is no fall. There is no like previous moment where like, oh, actually desire did lead to like ultimate satisfaction, and we lost that. So we have to regain it through, like denial of whatever this current system is. No, we've always already fallen. And that seems to elicit a different response, right?
Right. Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I think that when I read this, the reason I thought it was interesting is because I almost read what Chu was saying is valorizing this element of the universal existential condition that people hate, but maybe that she's saying, or at least I would say, that there's actually something potent and powerful in self-negation, that self-negation precisely shows that outside, that it shows that which is kind of contesting the world system that tells you have to just be like a complete thing, but that self-negation is essentially kind of a political outside, right? And I thought it was kind of interesting because as a trans woman, she's much better than I have anyway, lived in different spheres, different positions of sexuality, different encultured, lived gendered positions. Now, I don't know to what extent she ever identified as man, woman. I don't know how she identifies now. But the point is that there's something interesting about someone going through this transition that maybe experienced embodied maleness and a lot of the social, structural benefits, let's say, that go with that. And then now going into being a trans woman, does that not open up like different horizons of meaning that allow her to kind of like speak one of her own process of maybe like self-negation, like negating those elements of self that she's like even noticed in herself from before when maybe she was identifying as a man or whatever, I don't know. But it seems that there is something interesting in this idea of self-negation as being an essentially political like attestation of that which is excessive and outside of, let's say, patriarchal capitalism. Yeah?
Yeah, I like that idea of attestation and like protest, because, and you kind of get the theme here from Chu's earlier essay that we talked about, the my new vagina won't make me happy. Um, Assuming that we can give this diagnosis and then engage in some, like, to use a psychoanalytic, like Lacanian term, a subjective destitution, which then leads us to like pure happiness or whatever, like the psychoanalytic cure. Um, that seems like more like the Nietzschean route, which is like, here's the diagnosis, and so the answer is embedded within the diagnosis, right? Yeah. We called that, like, reference back to G.A. Cohen's idea, the like obstetric like metaphor, right? If we can just do the diagnosis correct, the answer will come out of it, obviously. And that might just be wrong. It might be that we have to sit with this and accept that the diagnosis tells us that things are fucked, that we're not going to have a resolution to this, right? At least right now, and kind of be okay with that and not have an embedded answer inside of it. That was kind of the lesson, I think, from the essay, the earlier essay from a couple of years ago. And maybe there's a similar idea here. Like, Lacan's answer in some sense is like, go out and like publicly masturbate, right? Like fuck the symbolic or whatever. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's the case that we have to sit with this kind of like psychic contradiction for a little while and deal with it. Maybe, see, I was reading everyone is feeling, everyone hates it as like this like obvious criticism. Let's get out of femaleness. Then you're viewing it in a different way, and that kind of making me enlightened a little bit to like, well, maybe everyone is feeling, everyone hates it, but that's not obviously good or bad. That doesn't obviously give us the answer.
Right.
Let's just sit with that for a minute.
Yeah, that's kind of, because that's when she says that it's a universal existential condition, that was kind of how I thought of it, as kind of like a de facto state of affairs is what she's saying, rather than making a normative claim about it, Yeah,
or at least the normative claim that follows from it is not like already embedded within it. Like, murder is wrong. It's a moral claim, right? But it's like a descriptive one. And it has embedded in it that you shouldn't murder people, right? In some sense. But maybe this isn't like that. Maybe this is everyone is feeling, everyone hates it. And that's just a descriptive statement and doesn't have any like clear, obvious, embedded normative implications.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. And then if you do want to open it up to some kind of... Yeah.
Like, I hate that too.
And then I think it... You do?
Not in a bad way. No, like in a it makes me uncomfortable sort of way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. I can see that. See, I kind of liked it because I thought it opened it up to the possibility of some sort of almost like immediate political contestation, like you were saying earlier, that that it is precisely the fact that everyone hates it, but then why does everyone hate it? Why does everyone hate it? Because one, self-negation is uncomfortable. Two, it doesn't fit within our social, economic, political landscape at the moment. Three, psychically, it's just simply uncomfortable, right? But then the question is,
like, it elicits suffering. Like, that's, I think, clearly why the word hate is appropriate there.
Right, and then this is where Nietzsche comes in. Nietzsche would be like, yeah, it is, but it's bad. So stop self-negating, fucking pussies, right? That would be like the Nietzschean response. And I don't think that that's right either.
No, it correct that it's bad. But the idea that it's bad, therefore, normative implication X is not the proper response, maybe.
What do you think about the Christian call to like die to self and whatnot now, many years outside of the church?
Yeah, man, this is like one of my favorite things to think about, because I think it's like it delivers this ultimate tension, right? In that self-negation, in that moral sense that comes from like the take up your cross mentality, denial of your own projects and desires, is so obviously weaponized against people on the losing side of like social power, right? Told to basically enjoy their suffering because they deserve it, or it's necessary for progress, or whatever the reason is, right? It's weaponized in this terrible way that I think we should definitely like not do.
God loves the least of these kind of thing.
Yeah, so stay the least of these, please.
Yeah, exactly.
The poor you'll always have with you, kind of a thing. and then, or like the poor as like a means through which the rich can, achieve their salvation or whatever. It's another form of it. There's that portion of it, but there's also something necessary about self-negation, right? It's clearly just like becoming a slave to your desire is not the answer, because that itself is a form of like slavery, right? It's not freedom. It's not anything good. It elicits tons of suffering because we're self-reflective human beings who can't just give ourselves over to animalistic satisfaction of desire without, losing part of ourselves. So self-negation, actually deciding which of your desires is good and bad, and then, rejecting the ones that you think are bad and accepting the ones you think are good, and maybe even reforming your desires based upon your meta desires, right? Your desires for your certain desires to be the case, is a very human thing. And so it becomes this, because of the social conditions that exist, which place us in such a way that self-negation can be a good or bad thing, and it's not clear in any instance which it is, right? It could be both at the same time in certain instances. And so that, I think, creates this like incredibly bewildering tension in our minds, where we end up being like practically paralyzed. We don't know what to do anymore because we've kind of overthought this. But the problem is, underthinking it isn't an answer either, right? Because then that's just like another form of like becoming a slave to your own desires. In this case, a slave to like ignorance or whatever. So like, taking drugs to figure out how to achieve enlightenment would be like a way to, I think, do that, enact that practical ignorance, which I don't think ultimately does anything, although it could be fun. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot here, but I love this idea of self-negation because it's so kind of paradoxical.
Yeah. It's as much as I find Nietzsche's critiques to be a bit wrong-headed and themselves almost kind of reactive. There is something.
I know, right? How wonderfully ironic is, in the more Setian sense, is Nietzsche like talking about other people being reactive or reactionary.
I know. It's so funny.
The guy who you can hear yelling through the pages.
I know, it's perfect. But when he does criticize the self-hating of Protestant Christianity, I agree, right? I mean, I do think that is something that is especially... I spent a lot of time in communities that were highly influenced by the Puritans. And you'll never meet a group of more self-hating, austere motherfuckers than the Puritans, right? Like, I read what Matthew Henry and John Owen and fucking Jonathan Edwards and, I mean, you name it. Like, I was inundated with that stuff, right? Like, my father is still a part of a Reformed Baptist church that confesses the 1689 London Baptist Confession, which is basically the Westminster Confession, but without baby baptism. And he just got back from a retreat where the head pastor guy he's like the pastor of some Puritan seminary, like that's what it's called. It's in like Michigan. It's like the Puritan seminary, whatever. And so there's a sense in which I have like a real familiarity with the Puritans, and that I used to buy fully into that idea of mortifying sin. But it turns into this morose self-hating. And so there's a liberation that you can find with like a Nietzschean self-affirmation that criticizes that self-hatred, and that can like lead to a type of hedonism or something else, where you aren't hating yourself, but then you start pursuing pleasures and enjoying your own passions, and you find purpose in things, and you can actually invest in this world. You can invest in people, because then you don't just think that all of your intentions are evil and sinful, and you don't constantly second guess yourself. And so there's a freedom in that. And so I find there to be like a real ambivalence between that freedom that Nietzsche speaks of, but also realizing that he might be going a little bit too far, and then at the same time of also kind of wanting to take up the mantle of Socrates and to know thyself, which implicitly means to care for the self and to work on yourself and to transform yourself. And I think there's even like a psychoanalytic mandate to kind of like subjective destitution, but to kind of transform your psychical condition, especially address, if you will, your perversions and neuroses and psychosis or whatever, and to become adjusted, that there's a sense of self-negation that takes place during that process too. So I kind of like feel pulled between two directions,
Yeah, I like that a lot, because I do think the way I always kind of understood the sort of usefulness, the utility of psychoanalytic categories is through that virtue of knowing thyself. Not as just like, gobbledygook that's meant to like interpret desires to always be like sexual or whatever. And kind of like the stereotypically Freudian sense, but to actually be like this project of knowing yourself so you can actually properly act, right? You can't really fundamentally act and know what you're doing when you're acting unless you know yourself. You know what your desires and your beliefs are.
Yeah.
And so there's a project there of actually coming to understand yourself such that you can actually act and not be just engaging in like mere behavior or something. I think there's a kind of a moral condition there, right? In order to act appropriately and do the right thing, you have to be able to know yourself to some degree, and that's a lifelong project. We probably never actually fully fulfill it, right? But I think we kind of have to at least try in order to be said to be acting appropriately. And so, yeah, I think it all kind of follows from that same sort of inducement to know thyself.
Yeah. Did you have any summarizing thoughts on anything surrounding the essay or anything else?
No, man, this was like an old school episode of Owls at Dawn, where we start talking about a thing for like 10 minutes and then we end up like 50 yards away.
We always go back to the Greeks. Fucking Socrates. Yeah. No, that's cool. I mean, I'm really curious. I want to read the book. I like her writing. And it's interesting. When I read the review, and she mentioned that, there have already been a lot of blogs and subreddits and whatnot that have been critical of the book. It totally makes sense, because I get like a real Lacanian vibe from the way that at least this review presents Chu's book. And feminists have a real problem with Lacan, right? And not all. Obviously, we had Isabel on a couple of episodes ago, and we kind of talked about that. We worked through that. But generally speaking, I can totally see why feminists would have a problem with some of these provocative claims. And then if there is that Lacanian psychoanalytic underpinning, then I'm like, oh yeah, then I totally get why people would have a problem with a lot of the arguments that she puts forth,
Yeah, and if you want a good explanation for why Lacan actually should be the greatest comrade to feminists, go back to that episode with Isabel, because that was, I think, the best encapsulation of why feminism and Lacan should be hand in hand that I've ever heard.
Agreed. Well, sweet. Well, let's go ahead and finish up the main segment there, and let's jump into the sticky leaves, brother. Yeah?
So sticky.
All right, so now we're going to jump into the sticky leaves. This is the portion of the episode where one of us gets to recommend something that is bringing us joy in a world that is potentially meaningless. So, Troy, what's making you happy, man?
Dude, I love the new Watchmen TV series.
Oh, yeah, you messaged me about this.
I recommended it to you. It is so good. So, a little background. Have you read the Watchmen comics or graphic novel?
Never.
So, I read the Watchmen comics, the series of 12 comics that were kind of put into one graphic novel later on, I think, by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. I read them in, I think, 2008 or 9. It was right when the Zack Snyder movie came out, and I wanted to read the graphic novel before the movie came out. And my roommate at the time, had it in our flat. So I just read it over a weekend right before going to see the movie. And it's the kind of thing you can read in a couple sittings. It's long for a comic book, obviously, but it's not so long that you can't. And it's so engrossing that you'll want to spend hours and hours in a row on it. And I've never really read comics. I didn't read comics growing up. I've probably looked at maybe 3 or 4 comics in my entire life, like actually opened them up and actually like digested any of the material. So I have basically no history with comic books. Watchmen was the first thing in that genre that I've ever fully read and like really was enraptured by and cared about. And I didn't really proceed to read anything else in that dimension at all, because it's just who's got time for that? Too many things to read. But I loved the graphic novel. I loved the comic. I thought it was so interesting, and that most of the rest of the comics that I'd even like glanced at before, I just was not interested. They didn't grab me in any way. They didn't seem compelling to me personally, for the themes that I just wasn't interested in. But Watchmen was different. It was about, the people, like the psychological individuals and how they're affected by this whole idea of being a superhero, as well as what superheroes would actually be like in real society, like if they would really exist with the current politics, right? And so Watchmen, the United States wins the Vietnam War because they have superheroes that they use as basically, political actors and military actors. And then the political structures of society are changed because of the existence of superheroes. And of course, only one superhero actually is a superhero. The rest of them are just masked vigilantes, basically. And so I thought the whole thing was super interesting. I loved the comic. Zack Snyder's movie kind of sucked, but that's neither here nor there. When it was announced that Damon Lindelof, who's famous for making Lost and The Leftovers, was going to do a sequel to Watchmen, I was very worried and scared and not at all anticipating anything good. I do like David Lindelof a lot. We've talked about Leftovers quite a bit on this podcast, I think, because it is amazing.
Love it.
Love it, yeah. But the thing about Leftovers is the first season was not so great. It was just kind of promising. And it was based on Tom Perrotta's book entirely. It was an adaptation of it. And the second and third seasons of Leftovers were not based on the book. They're extensions of the book. And those were amazing. So I should have seen this coming. That I kind of wanted Lindelof to just remake Watchmen because Zack Snyder's version sucked. But man, the exact same thing has happened. Extending Watchmen, like kind of somewhat faithfully following the thematic elements of Watchmen, but doing it in Lindelof's own way, has worked out perfectly. It basically is The Leftovers meets Watchmen. It's got the Leftovers theme and structure with the content of Watchmen. And so while it's not necessarily super faithful to the thematic elements of Watchmen, given that the mediums are different, it's going to be the case anyway. It's just so fun. It is bewildering and confusing and all over the place, but in the great way that Leftovers was too, where you're just like on the edge of your seat at all times and just loving every minute of the confusion and the mystery and the craziness.
Yeah.
And the acting is great and the dialogue is great. And I read Watchmen, and while I'm not like a super devotee of the book, I don't know like every like nook and cranny of it. I'm still confused at the show. Like I know who Dr. Manhattan and the comedian and all these people are who are just referenced, obliquely in the show. I can't imagine if you hadn't read the comic where you would be watching the show. It would
That's
just
what
be
I was going to ask. Like,
the most confusing thing ever.
Yeah, should one read the comic before they watch the show? Like, is that almost mandated prerequisite?
Or is the thing? I think you should, just because the comic is really good.
Okay.
And you'll enjoy it, and you can do it in like 2 sittings. So you should anyway, just for your own like personal, satisfaction. And I do think you probably will enjoy the series more having read the comic, because you'll see the references to all these elements from the comic. But also, given that it's still bewildering and mysterious and you have no idea what the fuck is going on, I wonder if that just gets amplified having not read the comic, and that might even make that part of it more enjoyable. I don't know. That's a counterfactual situation. So I'd be curious if anybody out there has not read the comic but is watching the series, how they've responded to the mystery and like just craziness elements of it. Because it's a wonderful. It's better than I could have possibly imagined this would have been. I was anticipating something bad just because I didn't think you could possibly do this thing, like a sequel to Watchmen that was actually good. And it's totally gone off the rails in a way that I'm loving. And maybe it doesn't keep up. Maybe this is just destined for destruction because you can't do something like this. But So far, every part of it's been great. I've loved it. And I can't believe this isn't like Game of Thrones level popular, or at least like the early seasons of Game of Thrones level popular. I'm not hearing too much scuttlebutt about it on the internet, and I'm surprised because I think it's thoroughly enjoyable.
What channel is it on?
It's HBO.
It is. Okay. Huh.
And dude, you like The Leftovers as much as I do.
Yes.
I think even if you don't feel like you have time to read the original comic, you got to give it a try, because if you love those themes from the Leftovers, nothing's going to scratch that itch like this one does.
Okay. Weird. Okay. Curious now. All right.
But yeah, you may want to wait until it's over so you can binge it.
That's what I was gonna say. How many episodes?
I think there's been 4, and there's going to be something like 8 or 10. So by the end of the year, I think it'll be over.
Okay. Yeah, I'll wait and then I'll binge it. So this is the first season.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. I should mention also, like, the basic setting is so the original Watchmen comic is set in the mid 80s, and Richard Nixon is still president. He's been president for like several terms, and the new series on HBO is set present day in 2019. So it's about 30-ish years, or almost 40 years, something like that. After the original comic. So the characters who are from the original comic who are still in this series are much older. And fucking Jeremy Irons is in it, dude. So if you don't have any other reason to watch this, Jeremy Irons is playing the villain from the original comic. And he is ridiculous and amazing. And I think he's on the moon, although I'm unsure about it. Like, literally, I think that his character's on the moon, but we're not sure. The setting is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is like a weird place to have like a superhero kind of TV series in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There's a whole background involving the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, which I actually was not familiar with before watching this series. I knew of this place called Black Wall Street in Tulsa. I'd heard that term before, but I didn't know what it referenced. And it was this area of Tulsa in early 20th century that where a bunch of African American owned businesses existed. There was a lot of like financial success for African American families there, and a bunch of like basically cops and KKK members came and just massacred the whole area and killed dozens and dozens of people and destroyed all the businesses, and like nothing ever really happened from that. And so that event plays a huge role in what's happening almost 100 years later in Tulsa. So that by itself, like that element of it should be, oh shit, I want to watch this.
Yeah.
Then just add in the fact that you have all this crazy shit from Watchmen in it.
Damn. Okay, I'll watch it. But see, now I feel like I need to read the graphic novel first. So you know what I might do? I might this weekend. I might go to the local bookstore. They'll have Watchmen there. I might get it.
It's worth it, man.
Okay. Maybe I'll do that first, because I feel like I need to at least get a basic grip on. Like, what if I just watch the movie? Is that fine?
No, because you're gonna hate it. It's not good.
Yeah, but what if I just watch it and then I'll understand the characters and shit like that, right? And then that'll be enough as a prerequisite, as a prequel.
Yeah, I just don't think you'll care about them. If you read the comics, you'll care about these characters. Watch the movie; they're so stilted and poorly acted, and there's been some. Even though Snyder really faithfully adapted like the scenes from the comic, the emotional character of it is not there. And also he changed the ending, which is super important because the TV series is based on the comic ending, not on the Zack Snyder movie ending. So you'll be like, what the fuck is happening if you're watching the TV series having watched just the movie?
Okay, so I got to read the book first. Okay. I know what I got to do.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I'm curious. Anybody out there who listens to this, who is a bigger comic book fan, Watchmen fan, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. There's been a lot of pushback from the comic community, I think, against the new TV series because a lot of there's a lot of racial and like I guess you could say kind of like feminist elements in the TV series that do not exist in the comic because there's a certain weakness to the comic in terms of having like female characters who have like an interior life and stuff like that, and
Right.
you know, African American characters, non-white characters who actually have like a role to play in the story. So there's been some pushback there, and also one of the like favorite characters from the comic, whose name is Rorschach. He has followers in the new TV series, and they are basically the new KKK. And Rorschach is kind of beloved by a lot of you know, young white males. So there's pushback there too, but I think there's a good reason why those followers have become basically the new KKK. So I'm curious what anybody out there, their responses to it, if they see this as problematic, or they can see some of the through lines that I think are there too, that make more sense of the connection between the new TV series and the original comic.
Cool. Yeah, you can email us, owls@dawnpodcast@gmail.com.
Or just at me, motherfuckers.
Oh, yeah. Twitter. Tweet Axe Wielder of Death. DETH.
I'm asking you to at me. This is the first time ever.
Yeah, this is the first time you've ever asked for any sort of social media attention. This is serious shit. I think everybody who listens to this should flood Troy's Twitter just for shits and giggles.
Shit.
If you don't have a Twitter, just get one and just flood him, even just to say hi. Just be like, or fuck you, or Lakers suck, or Rorschach is a racist fuck. Whatever it is.
I'm deleting my account forthwith.
Well, cool, man. Yeah, I am curious. You hit me up about this a couple weeks ago maybe, and I put it out of my mind because I was like, oh, it sounds interesting, but one, there's just too much to watch, too much to read, too much to do. But yeah, fuck it. Come on, man. You got to watch good TV, and I do love Damon Lindelof. So, okay.
Yeah, if anything, just trust that Lindelof has something interesting to say.
Okay. Cool. All
right, dude.
Yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up the episode there. Thank y'all for tuning into another episode of OAD. Go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn to support us. Email us, owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. Twitter, Insta, owls_at_dawn are our handles. I think that's it, unless there's anything else you want to say, dude.
Just one more thing I can think of, dude.
What's up, brother?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.